In this video, I'm going to be talking about well-defined aspects of our existence and how we can well-define things not just through writing, but in photography and in image and visuals. And photography is really, really good, and it's something that in the modern day, as of what's accessible in the currents of where we are in society and where society has come and where we've evolved and developed technologies to be able to access high resolution images, that you no longer have to rely so much on being able to mentally conjure from your mind and mentalize various cityscapes or what we encounter in every day, in which has all these complicated subject matters to them that represent the world that surrounds us, and which is near and far almost never really simple. And there's always a deep complexity to the surrounds, and we really have to go out of our way to even get to simplicity. But even then, you can sit in a room and try to get rid of all the sound, but the amount of effort it takes to be able to numb or null all the senses is incredibly difficult. And what tends to be more natural is actually this complexity. And you see that emerge most in the Baroque period of art history, and this is around the time of the Renaissance, where there's this return to truth and more objective truth, a movement towards objective truth that's trying to identify the aspects of our existence that are most true, but yet at the same time that includes a subjective-objective truth, subjectivo-objectivo relationships that the artists are really bringing to life as they engage in painting, that has these realistic elements to them, but at the same time is the world of the artist. And it's the world of the artist come to life on a page with often oil painting. You see that more common in the Baroque period, but even sketching and various forms of sketching that have that traditional style of shading, that have these pronounced lights and dark elements to them, but that also take to the ancient pencil with graphite in it that you can press to a page and create these different sculpted images of shadow, shade, and arrays of different grayish, darkish, blackening tones on a often backdrop that is more of a pale sort of color. And at times will sometimes have a browny sort of pigment to it, a very, very light browny pigment to it, especially if you look at older sheets of paper and more ancient sheets of paper and paper that's aged. And what you see is that the Baroque artists are often engaging in a manner of creating dynamic movement in what's paradoxically a still image. And this has been very influential in creating more of these dynamic movements that bring to life the image. And we see things like film and photography really emerging shortly after this renaissance in art that's returning to a way that's more true, and true that moves the subjective truth towards a psychological truth. If you think of that subjective-objective truth continuum, the subjectivo-objectivo relationships that are established there are more calibrated to what's realistic or objective, in regards to that we're never really still, and nothing's ever really still. It's constantly in flux and moving and impermanent and changing and dynamical. and we're always situated to it in some regard. And you see that often in the reflection of the sun moving throughout the day and changing its position, and the light constantly transforming. And if you were to say try to get shade during the summer under a tree, you might have to get up and relocate yourself. And certainly, actually, depending on, if you have a garden and you have certain plants require more light, and some plants require more shadow too throughout the day. All plants need light exposure, but they need also, some of them, too much light can be damaging and overwhelm them, such as nightshades like blueberries, and other nightshades like tomatoes. But certainly the marijuana plant too, it enjoys both sun and darkness, and it tends to be very sensitive to that. And it's a very, very colorful and expressive plant too. If you see it, it has these crystal-like structures on it that have these more complicated, information-dense properties that have aesthetic elements to them, that have unique emergent cause and effect relationships that can transform our direct perception through ingesting it and heating it, and that can transform the chromatic properties, because we know that the tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the THC property of it, interacts with light and light absorption and has different chromatic impacts, and it tends to influence our perceptions through visual pathways. And it's also, you might not know this, but classified in the classification of hallucinogens, because it changes perceptions, though it doesn't necessarily change the eye's mind in regards to being able to create more vivid perceptions. But what it does do is it tends to engage our visual systems in different ways that allow us to look out in the surrounding environment and perceive things differently, and with different meaningful emotions that tend to be primarily visual in that regard. And you'll notice that it tends to also, if you've ever consumed cannabis, or somebody who has smoked marijuana, or who also smokes marijuana very often, it tends to affect the eyes quite a lot, even increasing blood flow to the eye. But also you'll see sometimes shuddering, and there's emergent meaningful emotions that you'll see, particularly in individuals who are, stoners, and I include myself sometimes in that, because I actually have experienced what I call as particularly a stoner Duchenne smile, which is, even during sober moments, I can experience a sort of high that's more positive in emotion, and which I might get a cackle or spontaneously laugh, or experience a positive emotion that's radiant and that makes me smile, but I can feel the weight of what it's like around my eyelids that have this sort of squint to the sides of them, that are a reminder of those positive experiences I had. And it's very interesting because it sits there, and it's emergent with having engaged in those prior behaviors, and creates these prior existing categories that have affected not just the psychological process in regards to the mental representations in regards to direct perception, but has this direct mind and body connection that impacts meaningful emotions that have influenced the neuronal wiring within my eye and the cranial nerves, and particularly the visual tract and the visual centers of my visual system that are highly concentrated around the eyes. And Duchenne smiles, what they have, they're true authentic smiles, and signs of a person experiencing high levels of positive emotion, higher order positive emotions, that are hard to feint or fake. And this is the same thing as that, only that it has emergent properties in regards to a memento of those experiences, and that are positive in regards to recalling what it's like to have those transformative perspectives, and that are really hard to explain to an individual who, say, hasn't had or consumed marijuana, because it's much like that artist engaging in that form of painting, that as you're engaging in the act of, say, sketching with a pencil to a page and putting graphite there, you're instantiating different meaningful information processes as you're engaging in the hand-eye coordinations and those movements. And you might, say, try to approximate various aspects of the environment that a photograph does at a well-calibrated, higher order calibratory process that's more near to it, and that creates more precise but not proximate representations. Because even if you, say, take a picture of something, a photograph, you'll notice that there's subtle differences between the image that you take and the actual environment. And there's a few things that you can notice. It's much like, in some sense, when you look in a mirror and there's a flipped image, so there's that property to it, but at the same time there are emergent components to it. And especially if you have different exposures to the sun in particular, because the sun tends to be the most powerful source of light, when you take a picture, sometimes you'll get this, what I like to call a floating eye. And it's sort of like an emerald, has sort of like an emerald iris to it. And around it, there's this subtle yellowish tint to it that moves around as you move the camera, which is refracting light back towards the sun, because the lens is bent a bit. And that creates a sort of pattern that's very, very unique, and you can get these emergent images within a photo that is different than the eye. When we're looking at something with the eye, it's not the same thing as the camera lens and how the camera lens actually absorbs light. There's different properties that they have, but they're very, very, there's certain parallels to them and these reciprocal relations. And these contours emerge in regards to the photograph. And what that contour is, it's well defined as the subjective-objectivo relationships that constitute what is these cause and effect relationships and dynamic associations with emergent properties that are closer to that subjective truth and are specific to the devices of observation, let's say, and direct perception, in which you have, say, if you were to draw a straight line without a ruler, there might be a bit of a squiggle, and that's more proximate to a contour, because it brings in elements of existence that are more unique and that are not necessarily exact, but are exact in regards to what's original. And they have some distortion, but in a minimal manner to some regard, and which tend to capitalize more on the meaningful subject matter that create what are more of these validated as valid, psychologically true, and meaningful instantiations of that aesthetic experience. And the Stoner Duchenne smile is much like that, in that you really have to engage in a certain set of priors to be able to develop the neuronal wiring that creates these specific meaningful emotions that are associated with the development of subjectivo-objectivo relationships that constitute subjectivo-objectivo truths that are ultimately psychological truths, and they're not necessarily pure objective truths. And I don't think there is any sort of pure objective truth there are more refined objective truths and things that move towards a higher end of the objective continuum, but we tend to be much like what the Baroque artists are really starting to hone in on and meaningfully identify and make prominent and well known and well defined in their prior instantiations of capturing the dynamics of existence within a still image that suggests movement with the way lines and various strokes of the pencil to a page can make dynamical various impressions left behind in the mind that we anticipate, okay, maybe this is happening within that scene, and it helps to tell a story. And this helps to develop great ideas in the evolution of art and word and literature too, that help to influence photography, film, and most importantly, comic books, interestingly enough. And you see comic books actually tend to be much more dynamically engaging of meaningful emotions than other forms of text, and they're easier to interpret. And if you're trying to learn, often you even see this in kids' books because they'll have pictures and then words to them, but comic books are more well-calibrated than what you will get in a children's book. And often what children's books have to do is they have to really simplify words to be able, for the kids to even be able to themselves read it independently, because sometimes the words aren't well calibrated enough to the image. But you have a dynamic scene in a comic book where an individual, say, engaging in a suggested motion, it's still, but there's an anticipation the way that image is moving that suggests that they're engaging in what's being said in terms of what's typed out in text. And that is much more engaging of meaningful emotions. And you get that only really re-emerging in the Baroque period, and emergent properties too that are bringing to life, and really kind of like what you get when if you really want to improve your art skill, just increase the amount of boldness that surrounds certain modeling images of characters that you have, say, depicted on a sheet of paper, or specific subject matter, even a tree, doing a more bold outline of the sides of the tree, where if you'll notice actually looking at something, these bolder lines don't exist. It's the artists who really manufacture them and bring them into existence, and these are contours that come into existence. And it's not quite exactly a parallel, but it's more approximate to a reciprocal relation in which there are highly similar properties. And it's not wrong to call it a parallel, though I would state that in proposition, meaningfully, that a reciprocal relation is much more precise, because it identifies specifically two different A and B as subject matters in which we're examining similar properties that are meaningfully relational, in which we can identify what is mostly the same. It's not exactly the same, and nor could it be, because nothing is truly the same. Now, we could talk about things as if they're the same, such as I have a black pen, and then I find a black pen, and they're of the same make, but they could not be the same black pen. On some level, they do not share the same properties. Their ink might vary, the time they were made is going to vary. Maybe the quality of ink has decayed due to the time, or one's been exposed to a different degree of heat and cold. And these are more reciprocal relations, but we tend to process the gist of it, which allows us to have access to a term called same, and which we can recognize the sameness, but which is really meaning something that's more approximate to being meaningfully similar. And that's really what a contour is. But so it captures that subjective end of what truth is, and it includes it, and it's more psychologically true rather than, say, objectively true, even though it's, compared to, say, surrealisms, more objectively true, but it's bound to psychological truth, and psychological truth requires us to access the subjectivo-objectivo relationships that constitute truth. And there's a certain set of cause and effect relationships that, as a must, exist regarding the good enough and necessarily necessary conditions that constitute valid, psychologically true, and meaningful reciprocal relations regarding specific properties in which we can correct into appropriate categorizations that are bound to learning processes that develop categorical learning processes, and that aren't necessarily more shallow categorization processes, because they have to engage well-defined priors existing that deepen those neuronal pathways, so in our nervous system. So not only when we're thinking about a subjective-objective truth relationship, this subjectivo-objectivo truth dynamic and subjectivo-objectivo relationships operating within that dynamic require us to have these mental representations that are operations in the mind. And so they're these working parts regarding subject matters that we're manipulating in the mind, regarding its impressions that are mentalized in imaging of meaningful information that we have to not only categorize correctly, but we have to also well-defined categorizing processes that deepen expansivenesses of access to specific refined meaning interpretations with higher quality details that increase the well-calibrated definitions we have access within consciousness processes of it. And that means that we have an awareness and are awakened to certain elements of existence which regard objective properties rather than subjective properties that subject matter. And so this is where we get the subjectivo-objectivo relationship, because we're perceiving something in regards to a mental category that we're calibrating to the external surrounding environment or objectivity that surrounds us in regards to the thingness of existence. And this pertains to and regards all mind-body connections in which are psychologically bound, and boundness to the situatedness of our existence regarding valid, psychologically true, and meaningful psychological truths that are, as a must, good enough and necessarily necessary conditions to validate and create subjective truths that allow us to make sense of the world around us, and to meaning interpretation the verbalized and nonverbal elements of perception, action, and behavior that the self and surrounds is processing in regards to meaningfulness. And that's all I wanted to say for this video. I hope you enjoyed it.